And welcome. I am Steve Hewitt, and this is me in conversation with Dr. Tim Wilson, who is the director of the Handa Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at the University of St. Andrews, who's written this amazing new book, which I actually got a copy of it right here, called Killing Strangers, How Political Violence Became Modern. Thank you so much, Tim, for taking time out of your busy schedule to chat with me.
Not at all, Steve, and really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the book. It's most generous of you.
So I think this would be of interest to those listening to just find out a little bit about you, especially how you got interested in history, but also this type of history as well.
Thank you. Well, by origin, I'm a Cambridge boy, so I grew up somewhere pretty safe and pretty quiet. But I remember about the age of 10 in 1981, picking up my dad's copy of the Times, and there was a picture of a kid about my age with wearing a balaclava and wielding a slingshot. It was during the hunger strikes in Northern Ireland, which sparked off major rioting. And I remember just thinking in my impressionistic 10-year-old way that, wow, this West Belfast place must be rather different from West Cambridge, and how right was I? So there was a sort of, I guess there were seeds there. My first big act of rebellion, having grown up in Cambridge, was to go to Oxford. But it was really after the end of Oxford that I decided I needed to do something different with my life. And by long and winding course, ended up running an after-schools club for kids in North Belfast during the peace process years of the early 90s. So I was sort of trying to run away from an academic career, which eventually caught up with me. But really, a lot of my interest in political violence and how, and in grassroots perspectives, how ordinary people cope with living with this stuff and what it does on a society-wide level. Really come out of those years in Belfast, which were fascinating and challenging. I'd be lying if I said there was any kind of forward direction or planning. There wasn't. There was no career planning at all. But with hindsight, I can see that a lot of my academic interests have come from that. Eventually, I did return to do a master's at Queen's Belfast, and then what Oxford calls a DPhil, a PhD, in other words, which was a crazily ambitious piece of work that tried to compare grassroots patterns of violence in the German-Polish borderlands and in the north of Ireland after World War I. And really, my academic career has derived and been built on those beginnings.
And I mean, an interesting question, because I know we both know Richard English, and I know Richard I've heard him talk about this in the past, that in his book, Armed Struggle, that he doesn't use the T word, but now he's come in the opposite direction where he thinks historians should embrace the T word. I mean, how do you describe yourself? Are you a historian of terrorism, historian of political violence, historian of violence more generally? I mean, or if you had to pigeonhole yourself?
I think I would probably see myself as a historian of political violence. As I say, I have worked on European history as well as Irish history. I had never considered really studying terrorism, and I think I had been sort of freighted with many of the traditional biases that historians have often had about terrorism as a subject, and whether it ever really can be a coherent subject. I think if one sort of sees the evolution of the term from the French Revolution and then into the late 19th century as a sort of, when it really meant the sort of intimidation of the forces of reaction, in other words, of ultra-conservatism, and then how it's developed since, it's hard not as a historian to see this as a moving target. It's kind of quicksilver. It's very hard to pin down. And so I hadn't ever really sort of seen it as, I hadn't ever really seen this project or my core interests as writing a history of terrorism. But one of the things about the move to St. Andrews now about 10 years ago, one of the things that it did was actually sort of force me to confront with, well, really the point that I think Richard saw before many of us, which is, where are the historians? Why can't we have a history of this subject in the same way as we have excellent histories of rioting, social banditry, so on and so forth. And the more I thought about it, the more that struck me as a sort of gaping hole that somebody needed to try and fill.
Which then, I mean, you mentioned what you did your dissertation on, which you published as a book, and now this new book. I mean, this book, I really enjoyed it. I've got and this is in part thanks to I have a paper copy, but I also had access to an e-copy, which is much easier to take notes. So I've got about 35 pages of notes, single spaced in terms of going through it. But one of the things that really impressed me was the range of sources in it. And I think people maybe that haven't done books don't realize how much work goes. You see the final product and you don't realize the whole process that goes. I mean, so when did you first conceive this, and how long did it take you to write this book?
Well, thank you, Steve, for those very generous remarks, and indeed for the invitation to have my therapy, if you like, recorded, because one suffers writing a book, but the people who suffer most are one's loved ones around one who haven't chosen the topic. Writing books, or writing good books, is not easy. I mean, to that extent, I was very much a traditionalist. I was kind of raised in the sort of the Oxford kind of mentality that one good book about every 10 years is about right, which is not at all the mentality of most of contemporary academia. But it took me 10 years. This is really a 10-year project ever since the book that came out of my PhD, Frontiers of Violence. It's taken that long. And yes, if I'm entirely honest, to me, for years, this felt like what I thought of as the teenage garage band second album syndrome. In other words, one had written one book and it had put a hell of a lot of effort into it. And then suddenly one had to come up with the goods of something that was hopefully even more mature or ambitious, or so on and so forth. And I just could not see how to do that. I couldn't see I had the time to do that properly. And I didn't want to sort of become like some sort of pop artist who released a load of, half-baked albums every 18 months. That there was some, hopefully there was some talent there once, but, they didn't spend long enough in the studio. So I wanted to spend a decent amount of time in the studio. There were a lot of false starts and dead ends and attempts to serve it up as a history of terrorism and getting sort of shot down at various seminars. So it wasn't in any shape or form really a linear process. And I think it's important maybe for students to hear that. We often don't talk enough about how books come to be written, but there's a lot of blood, sweat, toil and tears in the background. I only ever really got a chance to have a proper tilt at it when I was lucky enough to get a year's research leave, which is gold dust. For an academic is absolutely gold dust. And to be honest, what happened was the summer of 2018, I finally got that year's research leave. And from July 2018 until the end of March 2019, I did nothing but read a note. I'd been working on it before for years, but that was really the sort of the concentrated point. On the 1st of April 2019, I thought, well, I better start writing because I cannot return to St Andrews from research leave empty-handed. I'll be too ashamed. It was then written in 4 months. Pretty intensively, as is often the way with these things. I often think the image in my head is a bit like the circus strongman who pulls the train with his teeth. Getting started is the hard bit. Once you're rolling, it's a lot easier. But yes, I mean, I could have spent longer on it. It could have been, the project is ambitious and could have been a lot, could have been far longer and probably many volumes. This was the best that I could write in the 4 months that I had, but a 4 months that had 10 years of thinking and reading before that is the short version. So yes, there's a lot more kind of marinating of ideas before the serving up. I think that's the kind of key point that may not always be obvious about these things.
I mean, one of the things that really impressed me was the rich array of sources in the book. You reference a novel by Robert Louis Stevenson. You mentioned Beatrix Potter. You got a quote from a Welsh nationalist. You even have a mention of a 1973 anthology of sexual fantasies. How did you do the research? I mean, is just this, you're just keeping track of these sources over time? Did you have a research assistant? I mean, it's just so rich in terms of the variety of sources that you brought to bear in the project.
Thank you. I mean, I think one of the things I have learned is that research is an enormously idiosyncratic process, and no two academics will do it the same way. What I seem to be blessed or cursed with is a kind of flypaper mind, as I think of it. In other words, interesting nuggets and quotations tend to kind of stick to my memory. I'm not a good historian of ideas. I'm not a good historian of institutions and laws and that sort of thing. It's not how my brain works. But I do seem to remember kind of quirky anecdotes and sometimes store them for years. I mean, the boring kind of methodological argument or answer is that I was just, when I got the chance over those few months of research leave, I was just extraordinarily obsessive about taking lots of notes and then noting the notes, sort of creating an index from the notes. And I do it all longhand. But simply because if I stored things on my computer and then forgot the keyword, I'd be lost. So I tend to sort of survive in blizzards of paper, but eventually the blizzards get kind of put into drifts so that are vaguely organized, and one tries to then sort of create some sort of subject index. And then there's a kind of boiling down process. It's very arduous, but it seems to be the only way I can do this kind of writing. In terms of the actual source range, I suppose what I can only talk about what worked for me. But it's a piece of advice I would tend to give my students if they're doing an undergraduate dissertation or graduate dissertation, is never underestimate the worth of primitive search techniques. In other words, go to your library catalogs, go to your databases, of course, search them. Of course you should. They're enormously powerful tools that didn't used to be around. But always remember that any single database has been put together by a human mind, and I can guarantee to you that that human mind will work differently from your human mind, and it will arrange information differently. In other words, the keywords that seem natural to you may not be to someone else. So try and be creative around all that. But for this kind of project, what works is simply really just a trawling. And actually some of the kind of more idiosyncratic stuff, Beatrix Potter and so on and so forth, come from the fact that down the road is an absolutely excellent secondhand bookshop with a biography section, which I would go and browse on a Saturday morning, sneak out of the house, say I was going shopping or something, and see what I found. And it's extraordinary what you can turn up finding things you didn't know you were looking for until you found them. My favorite quotation, I think, is the one from the theatre critic talking about meeting Danny LaRue, in London just after 1968, and this sort of wonderfully pretentious quote about, we don't plan, the revolution is improvised, it's like jazz, all of which, it's just something I stumbled across, but as I say, it then lodged in my memory, and I tried to keep some sort of note of it. Really, one of the challenges of all high level research, I think, is kind of data retrieval. One reads and then one forgets where one's read it and can spend hours searching for a stray reference. So one has to try and be systematic, but for better or worse, that seems to be just the way my mind is constructed.
So you mentioned earlier about being a historian and the underrepresentation of historians when it comes to writing about the history of terrorism. How do you think this book is different by you being a historian, say, if this book had been written by a political scientist?
Well, that's an excellent question, and one in some ways really that I've spent the last 10 years thinking about in broad terms, given that I am a historian who's now in an international relations department and heads up a center in an international relations department. When I'm with historians, I sometimes find the lack of conceptual precision a bit frustrating. When I'm with political scientists, I sometimes find the lack of looking at anything that happened more than 5 years ago a bit frustrating. So I think a sort of dialogue is necessary. Having said all that, when pushed, as this book does, I've tended to take a relatively relaxed attitude to definitions. There's a bit of a side sweep at arid definitionalism. And it's not that I don't believe in conceptual precision. It's just that I think life is messy. And if one takes a sort of empiricist, neo-empiricist approach that essentially one's looking at the evidence and trying to find some sort of pattern in it, then I think one has to tolerate a certain amount of messiness, conceptual messiness. And that doesn't really bother me. So my attitude to that really is a little like the sort of, 3 little words that keep my marriage together, which are not as you might think I love you, but, get over it. It's, in other words, there may be fuzziness here, and in the book, I talk about terroristic violence. I come quite close to kind of Alex Schmidt's classic definition of, violence where, someone whacks group A to pass a message to group B. I mean, I come quite close to sort of acknowledging there's something there, but I don't want to get into, and I don't tangle much with the question of, well, is this particular incident that I'm looking at terrorism or not? It's deliberately a little more impressionistic, and sometimes the way I think of it is a little bit like the difference between a synchronic approach where, in other words, a lot of social science, political science, so on and so forth, tries to sort of take a phenomenon and freeze it in a moment of time, and at its best that gives you a kind of clarity, a bit like a precision sharp black and white photograph, as opposed to a diachronic approach, something that charts change through time, which is a bit more like a kind of blurry handheld YouTube clip. It may not have the same precision, but it may have a vividness and a contextualization that you won't get. And it's not that one is better than the other, it's that I tend towards the latter, but that's to say just the intellectual tradition I was raised in and how I tend to think, but it's not meant to be dismissive of political science approaches.
Yeah. In looking at the book, I mean, right on page 1, you mentioned it, and I'm wondering if this is sort of the governing philosophy of the book, that there's the famous propaganda by the deed. And you mentioned that there's been a lot of work done on the propaganda, but not much or less work done on the deed. I mean, is that your focus is on the deed more than the propaganda, would you say, in terms of the book?
Well, again, having my therapy, it's the best solution I could come up with to the challenge of sort of writing a history of terrorism. And to be honest, this is the kind of history of terrorism that dare not speak the name, if I'm honest. However I tried to do it in the early stages, it seemed to be unavoidable that one was essentially coming up with some sort of definition of terrorism and then reverse engineering a genealogy to suit. And that seemed to me to be sort of prejudging outcomes. The only way I could sort of try and get around that and still have some sort of coherence was to take a kind of micro obsessional focus on actions. It's impressionistic. The sheer breadth of the canvas of 2 continents and 250 years means it can only be impressionistic. But it did seem to anchor it a bit. It did seem to give it some sort of coherence, at least in my mind. Of course, it doesn't dodge all the issues. How do I know what is political violence? Well, again, I tolerate a certain fuzziness there with other phenomena such as serial killing that aren't traditionally interpreted as political, but seem to me to have what the philosopher Wittgenstein would call family resemblances with what we're looking at. The sort of the spree killer and the terrorist kind of shooter don't seem to me so different, even if the motivations are. So it tried to get away from motivations, states of mind, intended effects, the propagandistic world, not because I don't think those things are important, but just because I think they have been well studied. And it seemed to me there was a sort of rather conspicuous weak flank in terms of looking at morphology, at the study of pattern and of changing pattern of action, and that perhaps by putting the focus there, we might see something else that we hadn't seen before.
Mm. One of the things I found really interesting in the book was you talk a lot about the state, which I think going into the book surprised me as I was reading it. You do talk so much about the state. What do you see this role of the state in terms of the thesis of the book and in terms of how political violence became modern?
Well, I did end up foregrounding the state quite as much as I did, largely because I was a little bit frustrated by a lot of the sort of political science and terrorism studies literature that really didn't seem to have much sensitivity towards the historical sociology of the modern Western state. And as a historian, I'm rather more interested in sociology than many historians. As an undergraduate, we were sort of brought up to be rude about sociologists, but I've actually sort of developed a kind of respect for a lot of the work of people like Michael Mann since. And I think, what came through to me, that sort of body of historical sociology, was the coercive power and reach of the modern Western state is extraordinary. If one thinks of examples from the ancient world, such as the Roman Empire had no police force. There was a reason why houses in Pompeii were mini fortresses, because you couldn't depend upon the forces of the state, powerful as that state was, extraordinarily powerful by contemporary terms, to have that kind of fine tentacular reach to actually sort of control and police violence. You just couldn't, it just didn't have that capacity. And yet, we live in societies where if the local council wants, they can, stick a camera in your wheelie bin to see if you're recycling properly. And perhaps one should argue they should be doing that because the environmental crisis is severe. But that sort of capacity, that infrastructure, what I call the society of hyperorder, which is really just building on Michael Mann's idea of infrastructural power versus despotic power. Despotic power means you go and crush the rebels and burn every village in sight, but you can't actually control people's day-to-day lives. Infrastructural power is power exerted through society, where the government can effectively register you at birth, tax you, monitor you, and for the entire course of your life. So it's really building on a very old idea from Max Weber from sociology, that bureaucracy and coercion go hand in hand. And if you don't believe that, then the best example I can give you is wait until COVID is over, go and check a book out of Birmingham University Library and don't return it. See what eventually happens. You'll get polite emails and warnings, and then eventually you'll get less polite emails and warnings. And then if you carry on trying to use the library, then eventually some security guard will be called. And if you carry on defying him, then eventually the police will get called. In other words, bureaucracy, is always backed up in the end by coercion, which is why we get stressed when we get our tax returns or whatever it is. Obviously, that's meant as a thought experiment. I'm sure the Birmingham Library staff are lovely, and please don't test their patience. But there are ways in which the monopoly of violence of Western states, which is never total, but it is often historically and become pretty impressive. And when it becomes that powerful, then the actual violence behind it fades from view. And one can sort of really forget the kind of foundations of coercion upon which all states are eventually built. It seemed to me that one needed to foreground that to understand why so much of what is often called terrorism, anti-state terrorism, takes the hit and run forms that it does, because it is violence from the margins. But unless we start with analysing the coercive power of the modern state, we won't get our heads around those particular forms of violence. And I think it frankly lies behind much of the conceptual difficulty that seems to arise of writing integrated histories of terrorism and counterterrorism simultaneously. It's often kind of held up as something we should be doing, but outside of some impressive case studies of particular conflicts, it often doesn't seem to be a very easy thing to do. That really is what lay behind that impulse.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't help but think when you talk about the growth of the power of the state and how much that then drives the innovation on the part of non-state actors who are obviously, as you said, are unable to match the violence of states, but then have to find these new methods to sort of strike blows against states. Or, you mentioned aircraft hijackings, and then of course we can see how that morphs into 9/11, and then you've got the shoe bomber, and then you've got this kind of almost a chess match going on between the state and the liquid gel plot, and now we can't take liquids on the plane, and then the potential of an underwear bomb, and well, actually, as was attempted, and now the full body scans and all that kind of, just on a micro level, that kind of back and forth between the state and non-state actors.
Well, indeed, and I think the point to me that the point of view that I came to was that, yes, these modern Western states are enormously powerful, and certain threats, come on to recent events in America, soon, but certain phenomena like civil wars and coups really don't seem to have happened in most major Western states for a very long time. Those kind of threats seem to have become largely obsolete. And yet there's a sort of paradox here in that the public expectations of order then become so high that relatively minor infractions or challenges become sort of magnified and are seen as deeply destabilizing, even though, as Eric Hobsbawm said about 9/11, the material power of the USA was entirely unaffected. So the optics come to matter. And that was a sort of theme I found myself wrestling with in the book. And I think, as ever, it's very hard to write contemporary history. It's very hard to write a history of one's own times or very recent years and to see them in perspective. But there is an agnostic note in which I sort of chart the rise and the aggregation of power of modern Western states over 200 years. And then over the last 20, 25 years, the rise of the internet society seems to me to create a more ambiguous situation. I don't think governments and regimes, democratic regimes, are about to collapse left, right, and center. But the sheer rhizoid possibilities of the internet and the way it seems to sort of spark mayhem, even of a spontaneous and disorganized sort, it certainly has a destabilizing effect. It was one thing that, when I blundered into terrorism studies as a historian, that first of all puzzled me. As someone who knew a little bit about the provisional IRA and how professional they'd become by the early 90s, I was just very surprised by the sort of constant comments one would come across from MI5, MI6 10 years ago or so, saying, or 6 years ago, we've never been more swamped, we've never been more busy, we've never been more challenged. And you think, well, compared to the provos at their height in 93 or 1994, how can this bunch of amateurs with cars and knives, how can they be a threat? But then when you actually start looking at the sort of public expectations of how safe people expect to feel and the number of subjects of interest that the security forces are meant to be keeping an eye on, I think it becomes a little bit more understandable how this sense of bubbling crisis can become self-sustaining. So I certainly didn't want to kind of slip over into lurid prophecy of state collapse, but it did seem to me that perhaps a long-term trajectory had sort of run its course by the late 20th century, and we now enter more uncertain times.
Yeah. One thing that struck me in the book, and you talk a little bit about gender, about masculinity, is killing strangers is almost exclusively carried out by men. I'm just wondering about gender. I mean, I thought one interesting thing was you do talk at times about gendered violence, ritual attacks on women, shaving of heads, things such as that has a political element. I mean, one of the critiques, and I've got a friend and colleague who's a feminist scholar who's quite scathing about terrorism studies, and her argument is, that the personal is political, and that domestic violence, things that reinforce the patriarchy, is also political violence and doesn't get the kind of attention, except now with incels, that it's getting from terrorism scholars. I'm just wondering about how do you see the gender playing out in all of this?
Thanks, Steve. It's an excellent question. I do try in the conclusion to have a nod to feminist concerns and to say Max Weber's idea of the monopoly of violence is that there's always smoke and mirrors there. There's always a trick of the lighting because, as I think, a broad body of feminist scholarship makes the point very powerfully, so much violence is branded as domestic and somehow apolitical, and yet it's of course about power. So I think, from that point of view, there is a lot to that a lot of the personal is political, and that, we shouldn't leave that out. The Western states' monopoly of violence is always only partial and has been deeply gendered. It's been incredibly insensitive historically to the oppression of women. So I nod towards that. I think there is a sort of developing research agenda that may have come along just a little too late for my writing of Killing Strangers. But I'm thinking of Joan Smith's recent book, Homegrown, by looking at open sources, apparently identifying really quite a pattern by which many individuals, any men convicted later of terrorism charges, turn out to have some history of domestic abuse, of beating up wives and girlfriends, or at least some suspicion of it, even if they were never convicted. And I think it is a sort of book that does shine a pretty unflattering light on arbitrary categorizations of how political violence and domestic violence often get put in different boxes, and yet there may be more overlap. And I think that is, if anything, a sort of a fascinating research agenda developing. I don't know who's going to push it and how far, and I don't know what it does to the sort of binary distinction really at the heart of Killing Strangers, which in simplistic terms charts a long-term trajectory away from interpersonal killing to something more impersonal. And that I have begun to think a little bit about, well, some of these domestic violence cases where people do horrendous things to partners and then go out and kill strangers, is that distinction always so binary? Having said that, as a bit of a sort of neo-empiricist, I do think there are rich literatures that are interested in discourse and presentation and how female hijackers get presented as entirely different from male ones. Right. And I think that is convincing. I think they do get presented in entirely different terms. I'm in trying to chart action rather than interpretation. artificial as such distinctions may be, I'm still kind of struck by women have historically seemed to play really rather different roles in these kind of groups.
Yeah.
I don't know how far one can generalize. The data is often kind of fairly sketchy, but I think both in the suffragettes and indeed in sort of new left groups, whether underground and so on, that the women often seem a bit more skeptical in those groups of some of the kind of bomb throwing or bomb making tactics that the men seem to push. So I don't want to push that point too hard, but I think there are learned gender roles, and that may be significantly changing in recent years. But I'm sort of struck not that women are inherently irenic and can't do these things, but that historically they haven't tended to. Why not? And I think that, you know, that raises much deeper questions of divisions of labor that also parallel the relationship to warfare, which is kind of one of the submerged themes of the book, really, is how much should we look at terroristic violence around us and see it as related to warfare, and how much is it actually something different, a different tradition altogether.
Just to pick up on that point, because I thought that was, again, something that kind of surprised me is, and you do touch upon it in the conclusion, and that, I mean, I thought you would have in the book. I was surprised how little there was about World War I. There's a lot about the aftermath of the war, and you make really interesting points about there's a lot of sort of political violence going on in the 20s and 30s that is sort of written out of the historical record. I mean, just in the sense of moving from personal violence to impersonal violence. And I mean, the World War I obviously had mass slaughter and, you know, on an almost industrial scale. How do you see the role of warfare in terms of, I mean, and you do talk about this in the conclusion, but where does like the, you know, the scale of war that we see in World War I play into? Is it about desensitizing people to killing others? I mean, there's that wonderful moment in All Quiet on the Western Front where the German soldier kills a French soldier and then gets his wallet out and discovers the name and who the, you know, pictures of the person's, and then like it humanizes that. But obviously that conflict is the scale of it. I mean, there's the whole issue, obviously, of technology as well, and that, and you talk a lot about that, you know, grenades and guns and things like that being widely disseminated. But how do you see warfare connecting to the topic? If that makes sense.
It makes absolute sense, and it's something that I wrestled with, and if I'm honest, it was one of those themes that, as I came towards the end of the book and the time that I had to write it, I thought, oh, this is the next book, or perhaps this should have been a major theme of this book, because I think it's come up again and again when one tries to present this thesis, that often what people react by saying, well, yeah, but killing strangers is nothing new, and the examples they tend to take are often from the battlefield. And it seemed to me that perhaps there's a research project, not necessarily for me. I'm still getting over this one, but perhaps there's a research project on the relationship of terrorism and war. I'm thinking of Alex Schmidt's classic comment about terrorism being the peacetime equivalent of the atrocities of war, and I think this, as so often with his often quirky insights, I think there's something there, but I think one needs historical / sociological background. You know, I was struck by this very brief passage where I sort of try and dip. It is just a dipping. I mean, it's pond dipping, not deep diving. But I try and sort of, you know, sample some of the literatures on the early modern and medieval periods. And what is striking, it seemed to me, was that the sort of boundary between war and peace is not clear cut. In those periods. And one of the features of modernity is that it becomes so as states control their own territories far more effectively, and as international war with other states becomes a more clearly cut state of affairs, then that sort of boundary between war and peace becomes clearer. Civilian society becomes demilitarized, men stop wearing swords, and so on and so forth, and vice versa. So, you know, militaries become a kind of not just a part-time militia or feudal order, but, you know, something that's a kind of their own profession and culture. So I think if one is sort of sets things up with that awareness of this binary between war and peace being a kind of feature of modernity, then terrorism is somehow, warlike violence is out of place. It somehow seems to, at least in the kind of states I'm looking at, it seems to be sort of violence that's somehow out of place. Mm-hmm. But one of the surprises of trying to look at genealogies of tactics, of repertoires of contentionness, to borrow one of the more accessible phrases from social movement theory, is a lot of the chronologies don't seem to work. So I'm entirely open to persuasion that the experience of total warfare, especially in Europe in World War I and World War II, has some sort of brutalizing effects. I think one can trace that in certain specific ways that I try to. And it doesn't seem unreasonable to think it's going to have some sort of wider conditioning, kind of loss of innocence effects, you know, after the death camps, after, you know, human abattoirs, after nuclear, you know, atomic bombs and so on, then, you know, the potentials of human destruction are pretty unambiguously demonstrated. So one might expect that to have a fairly brutalizing effect. But if one then tries to match these kind of anti-state terroristic type tactics to that and how they develop, it often seems out of sequence. So if one takes hostage taking as a tactic, and I think here one has to differentiate between hostage taking as a kind of tool of social control, which has been endemic to armies and warfare for a very long time, how occupations are often conducted, but as a tactic of coercive bargaining, where you're trying to get something rather than just hold a population down. The earliest example I can find is 1896 with Armenian hostage taking. It's, you know, pretty much 20 years before almost before World War I. If one takes kind of mass casualty bombing, where one's trying to sort of target civilians fairly randomly, then, you know, I think the sort of first really organized campaign with timed devices and so on is, you know, I would put down to the, you know, Irish-American bombers in London, and this starts around about 1883, or slightly earlier actually, but the kind of more sophisticated devices get going about 1883. So it's kind of over 30 years before World War I. So it's not that I don't think the examples of total war don't have a wider effect, but it doesn't seem to be a linear process. And indeed, if one looks at the sort of political violence as it occurs in Europe, Western Europe after World War II, it's remarkably restrained. You know, the groups sort of do sabotage, but there's not a kind of instant brutalizing effect that we've just been through these horrors. So we're going to have lots of freelancers trying to kind of create carnage. That just doesn't seem to happen. So I think there's a puzzle there. I don't pretend to have solved it, but hopefully I've served up a higher state of ignorance, and that may be progress.
One final question, and that's just to take us right up to the present. You know, since the book's come out, we've had the pandemic. You've got over 100,000 people dead in the UK, close to 500,000 in the US. You've had the storming of the Capitol building. I mean, how do you think, would these events have affected the way you wrote the book or any of your arguments? Or, I mean, especially with the storming of the Capitol building, do you see that as part of the package that you're writing about? Where I guess it's a kind of, where are we going from this point towards in the future?
Well, no, it's an excellent question, and one I wrestled with during the proof stage, where one is tempted to tinker and make oneself look wiser than one was. I didn't entirely resist the temptation, but I did restrict myself to adding 2 words in, I think, the penultimate or third last paragraph. I talk about, well, we should really worry far more about melting ice caps, full stop, or pandemics, full stop. The all pandemics was added during a proof stage. So I didn't entirely resist the temptation, but I thought I'd better keep it at that, because I didn't want to sort of try and track the news. One couldn't do that. And it seemed to be bolder to take some risks and be proven wrong, hopefully in interesting ways, than not to. I mean, I think at one level, the pandemics, certainly through the lockdowns, demonstrate the sort of power of the modern Western state. They've been resisted, they've caused turmoil, of course. I'm not saying they haven't, but generally speaking, government's ordering everyone to stay at home. Mostly people have, and the government can enforce it if it needs to. So I think from that point of view, it's sort of actually kind of rather rather sort of demonstrated the point before the conspiracy theorists jump on me. I didn't organize the pandemic to make that point. But you know, I think, you know, this enormous tragedy that we're living through is certainly puts some of the threats in perspective. But again, you know, the virulent conspiracy theories and that have also arisen, you know, also I think speak to the turbulent effects of the information age. Now, as for the fallout of the US election, well, I mean, when Trump refused to concede, my book had just come out. I did find myself having several reactions. I mean, one, of course, I never wanted the United States to slip into some sort of civil war, because that would be, above all, a humanitarian and moral disaster. Some unworthy 5% of myself also didn't want it to happen, because it would go against the central prognosis of the book that, you know, modern states were pretty strong. I think I do try and deal with US exceptionalism to some extent. I turned a lot to Richard Hofstadter's classic essay on reflections on American violence, and why the USA looks so different both from Canada and from Western Europe. So I think, you know, I had allowed some recognition of different traditions. Yeah. But of course, the classic thing about Hofstadter's essay from 1970 is saying there's not really an insurrectionist tradition. You know, USA can be complacent because it's protected by big Cs and non-threatening neighbors, and it can tolerate interpersonal violence and gun laws and lax gun laws and ghetto violence, because none of it really threatens the heart of power. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that's what does seem very different from the US Capitol riot. So I went over the autumn, I sort of went through a kind of journey of thinking, well, I don't think this is going to be a kind of 1861 Fort Sumter moment, a kind of opening shots of the American Civil War. But then the Capitol riot happened, and it was extraordinary. I think we're too close to it to know what the long-term fallout is going to be. I do think there's a sort of certain optical effect that it shouldn't have happened. I mean, with more competent security arrangements, it shouldn't have happened, and it was preventable. So I don't see it as a sort of obvious evidence that the American state is about to collapse or anything like that. But the fact it did happen, by whatever chapter of accidents, and all historians believe in contingency, or most of them do, think of the Sarajevo assassination or whatever, clearly has effects, and the fallout is still rumbling around and will continue to rumble around. So I think we've got a reprieve. I don't think, as I say, the USA is about to collapse into civil war, but I've never seen anything quite like it in my lifetime, and I don't think we should dismiss it. But, you know, I think the longer term effects at the moment, we're still too close to it to call.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the book. Thank you for taking the time and to speak to me, and best wishes for the future.
Thanks very much, Steve. I really appreciate the chance to talk about the book. It's enormously generous of you. And please, for your students who are listening, if they do want to get in touch with me directly, I'm very happy to have a dialogue by email or whatever. So thank you for your interest. It's deeply appreciated.
Great. Thank you, Tim.